Okay. My job is to introduce a great champion and hero. One observation, I'm sure each of you are noodling over the numbers and the data that Jeff shared with us. I found it interesting, and you can make your own comment to yourself in your head, but I found it interesting that on a number of the data points in the slide, the gap in the responses between conservative and moderate Republicans was larger than the gap between Democrats and moderate Republicans. In some cases, a 30-point gap between moderates and conservative Republicans. So I'm just saying. Let me read Marian Wright Edelman's bio, and then I want to offer a note of personal privilege. Marian Wright Edelman has been an advocate for disadvantaged Americans for her entire professional life. A graduate of Spelman College and Yale Law School, Edelman was the first black woman admitted to the Mississippi Bar and directed the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund Office in Jackson, Mississippi. She has received over 100 honorary degrees and many awards, including the Albert Schweitzer Humanitarian Prize, a MacArthur Foundation Prize Fellowship, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian award, and the Robert F. Kennedy Lifetime Achievement Award. And I'm reminded to say a note of appreciation and thank you, because it was the triad of Robert F. Kennedy, Marian Wright Edelman, and Peter Edelman who put the issue of national poverty on this nation's consciousness in the 1960s. And so a round of applause also for Peter Edelman, who is here. Thank you, Peter, for your leadership and all that you've done. And you stood tall yourself, sir, on issues of poverty when it was not popular to do so, and so we thank you for that. Personally, it was in the 1980s when I was a practicing pediatrician in the East Coast and in Camden, New Jersey, and North Philadelphia. It was during the outbreak at the height of the crack cocaine epidemic that I, as a practicing pediatrician, became introduced to the nexus of poverty and hopelessness and drugs and what impact the crack cocaine epidemic was having on low-income families and hopelessness in our communities. And it was in the middle of that I was rethinking my career path, as I was so frustrated with the hopelessness and poverty that I was seeing in the neighborhood I was serving. And I went to a conference, and I picked up at a conference a report. And this report was on children's health and child poverty. And the report was from this group called the Children's Defense Fund. And on the back of the report, which is the thing I remember the most, was this logo of a tiny child in a tiny boat in facing very large seas. And the logo said, "Dear Lord, be good to me. The sea is so wide and my boat is so small." And 50 years since this nation declared war on poverty, 40 years since this woman founded the Children's Defense Fund, 35 years after the crack cocaine epidemic, we are still battling this monster called poverty in this country. And there is no more enduring champion, advocate, warrior, hero, shero on this issue than my friend, my colleague, my hero, Marian Wright Edelman of the Children's Defense Fund. Join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the things that we ought to do, perhaps, is to make the law of the sea the law of the land, because there are things called burden boats and privilege boats for sailors. And privileged boats are boats that are little boats like our sailboat that are absolutely buffeted back and forth by the tides and by the weather. And they have first priority. And the privileged boats, the big ones, who can turn and have motors and control what they do are the ones who are the burdened boats. And so it is time for us now to see if we can't begin to have that kind of protection for children on our land. But thank you, Bob. Thank you, California Endowment. Thank you, Grace, for convening. Thank you for all that all of you are doing and all of the more that you're going to do if you leave this conference, because this conference has to be about what are we going to do. You talked about, Jeff was wonderful and laid out that we can tell our elected officials that it's safe to be for ending child poverty. And I told Barbara that I'm so glad we've got half by 10. I want all by 10. These are children, and we should set a goal to end child poverty in the richest nation on earth. It's a moral scandal. And every year you wait, that's more children who are going off to prison. That's more children who are going to die. There's more children who are going to grow up maimed and hopeless. And so how deep is our sense of urgency about making sure that other people's children get what our own children we want for our own children? So let's do, and you've heard the individual stories, and you save 5 minutes on my talk to talk about the safety net does work. Think about how many more poor children we would have today if there were not a safety net, how many poor people would be here if we didn't have health care and didn't make the kind of changes we did. And this is a marvelously historic time, and I think it's calling to us. And I hope that we will hear and we will respond. And I want to just pick up on one other thing that Bob said earlier. We want to get some things done. I want to end the 50-state lottery of geography. I want children to be automatically enrolled in everything at birth. If the point is to help children, on all this bureaucracy. And I don't think a child in Mississippi should have less chance to health care than a child in Massachusetts. A child is a child is a child. And these are American children, are children in America. And God did not make 2 classes of children, and America shouldn't continue to have 2 classes of children. And we shouldn't have 50 classes of children, depending on the will or the lack of will or the politics of any state. And I'm absolutely convinced that this, if we don't come to grips with what has happened to our children, it is going to be our undoing. For those of us who read Matthew 25 and sheep and goats, America way down the road to becoming a goat. And it's going to be the undoing in terms of our military preparedness, our economic preparedness. And so if we can't do what is right and do what is just and do what is cost effective, we better do it, because it is going to be the undoing. We spend almost $700 billion a year to defend us against these external enemies, but the enemy is inside. And it is our ignorance of the lack of our failure to educate our children, prepare them for the future. If 74% of your children can't get into the military if they're between 17 and 24 because they can't read, prior incarceration record, obese, or health problems, we've got a problem. And so this is our largest military, economic, and national security problem. We better wake up. And so this is self-interest, but it is also about our salvation. Now, Washington has become a little bit more palatable in the last few months, not for the reasons that you think, because I think we're really living in another moment. I think we're being blessed at another transforming moment. If you look back, and that's because of the presence of 3 men now. There are 3 wonderful statues. When you come back to Washington, before you go up to the Congress, I want you to go to the King Memorial, because that's the one that's most well known. But there's a wonderful statue of Mahatma Gandhi on Massachusetts Avenue with his purposefulness, and it kind of reminds you of the miracle that he caused. And within the last month, we have a new statue of Nelson Mandela in front of the South African Embassy. And somehow, these 3 men have brought a strength to me. So go take that tour before you go up there and remember what these men did against every odd in changing the impossible. And then you go up and you deal with how you're going to deal with Paul Ryan and how you're going to deal with the Tea Party. But it's up to us. And so I just hope we'll get out and we'll give ourselves permission to get out of our comfort zones and to build that transforming movement that we really have got to build. So let me just start off. I was going to end with this, with a few quotes from Gandhi. This is really quite remarkable, and if you look at what Mandela has said, and you know a lot more about King, and then about the Pope. And I think it's a really marvelous signal that the Pope got selected as the Man of the Year, though there was a very dissonant thing that I saw recently, that some people in Time magazine were very unhappy that they'd announced the Pope early, because my gosh, it might have, they didn't know that Beyonce was going to come out with a new unscheduled record. And that probably would have been, and that symbolizes for me what we are facing in this country, between the utter uselessness and preoccupation with selling things and with the trivial, and with what I think God has sent us in new prophets in our time. And so I think we're privileged to be here. This is a very important year. Let me just read a few things from them. And Gandhi said, if we're to teach real peace in this world, and if we are to carry on a real war against war, we shall have to begin with children. And he sort of had the same thing. He says that poverty is the worst form of violence. Mr. Mandela, who was quite extraordinary, said, we owe our children, the most vulnerable citizens in any society, a life free from violence and fear. Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world, and I hope you'll remember that we've got a lot of laws that if we enforce them, if we enrolled every eligible child, we now have 95% of all children eligible. Couldn't get those undocumented, it's an ACA. But we've got an enormous opportunity there. We've got an enormous opportunity with your new school funding formulas. Take the stuff that's on the books and use it and make sure that it matters, because if it's not implemented, it might as well not be there. And so again, look at all the opportunities that you have. Mandela also said something that was reminiscent of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who said, there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. Mandela went on to say that massive poverty and obscene inequality are such terrible scourges of our times, times in which the world boasts breathtaking advances in science, technology, industry, and wealth accumulation, that they have to rank alongside slavery and apartheid as social evils. In this new century, millions of people in the world's poorest countries remain imprisoned, enslaved, and in chains. They are trapped in the prison of poverty. It is time to set them free. That is what we're here about. Overcoming poverty is not a task of charity, Mandela continued. It is an act of justice. It is the protection of a fundamental human right, the right to dignity and to a decent life. While poverty persists, there is no true freedom. And so let's throw in Pope Francis now, because this is a mighty wonderful set of echoes that are coming to try to sort of say, get up, get up. This is another moment when I think God is trying to move us to move history, and I hope we will hear that. And Pope Francis says a population that does not take care of the elderly and of children and the young has no future, because it abuses both its memory and its promise. And he said, as long as the problems of the poor are not radically resolved by rejecting the absolute autonomy of markets and financial speculation, and by attacking the structural causes of inequality, no solution will be found for the world's problems, or for that matter, to any problems. And lastly, there was a young South African woman who did an extremely moving poem on NPR. It was called The Black Pimpernel. But there was one phrase that is going to be the context for our children's defense budget, our State of America's Children Report, which you will get next month on child poverty. But she said, this is the hour of tomorrow. This is our hour of tomorrow, in trying to sort of talk about the legacy of what Mandela had bequeathed to us. And I just hope we won't blow it. And I really hope we will find our courage, that we will become the Rosa Parks and the Martin Luther Kings and the Fannie Lou Hamers of an earlier era under much more difficult circumstances, and do what we have got to do to honor the extraordinary cloud of witnesses who transformed in 200 years of American apartheid with almost nothing except will and the determination that their children are going to have a better life than we have. So stand up. And I told the story recently because I loved my favorite moment down at the Selma to Montgomery March was Miss Amelia Bowen, who is 103. and everybody was there in Selma praising her for all that she had done on voter suppression. And she said, and how they were standing on her shoulders. She said, "You're all coming in here and you're all telling me about how proud you are to stand on my shoulders." She said, "Get off my shoulders. Get off my shoulders and start walking and building your own paths and your own roads. So y'all do what Ms. Thornton says." Now, in 1964, because we're really at one of those, I think, an inflection moment in our history, a whole lot of stuff went on that was extraordinary and absolutely unpredictable. We all are celebrating the 1963 March on Washington, but look at what got done 50 years ago in 1964, and how are we going to honor that? All year you had the Voting Rights Project organizing with crazy old Jim Bevel, bless his heart, and Diane Nash, and SCL. It was the period when there was a lot of direct action and nonviolent education, and we need a lot of direct action today and nonviolent education because we got to have a new movement. And we need to continue the reports and continue the conferences and continue the lobbying and continue the policy implementation. But and Charlie Houston and Thurgood Marshall did an unbelievable thing over a period of decades, short decades, with very little resources because people wanted their children to have a better life. And they got Brown versus Board of Education. They didn't anticipate all the resistance, but if it hadn't been for Ms. Park sitting down, it hadn't been for the Freedom Rides, it hadn't been for the sit-in movements, if it hadn't been for all those kinds of nonviolent witnesses, we would not have the progress that occurred in 1964, which was the enactment, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Those are Birmingham children. That's Fred Shuttlesworth. And Fred Shuttlesworth was, I think, of all the courageous people who went on in the South, Fred Shuttlesworth was, without doubt, I think, he was crazy, he was wonderful. But he was a crazy man. And he was a crazy man who believed in God's protection. And so you can almost feel him when you hear his stories. And things change. I mean, I love now when you go down to Birmingham, it's the Fred Shuttlesworth Airport. And it is the Fred Shuttlesworth Parkway that led up to the nursing home where he was sitting. But it was the Birmingham movement that in '63 that carried over to '64. But then you had the Mississippi Freedom Summer. You had the voter registration in the state, and you had all these young people coming in, and we need to reenact that, and we need to talk about what is our Mississippi Freedom Summer this coming summer in commemoration of the 50th anniversary of what went on in Mississippi, which was a miracle, in which 3 young men got killed. And what I remember most is that news came in Ohio when the training hadn't been finished and not a child left. Bob Moses said, "You wait here for a day and you decide if you're going to go down there," because we knew it was going to be dangerous. We didn't know it was going to be this dangerous. Not a young person left. And many people forget that those young people were killed going to investigate. They left Ohio early, going to investigate a church that had been burned down where there was going to be a freedom school. And so one of the things we can do in '64 and this year, 2014, came up, is have freedom schools everywhere to get children out of harm's way on the streets. But think about how you're going to commemorate that Mississippi Freedom Summer. The Civil Rights Act was signed. The 24th Amendment abolishing the poll tax in federal elections was signed. Then the Freedom Mississippi Democratic Party. Delegates challenged the seating of the white Mississippi representatives at the Democratic National Convention, and Miss Hamer spoke eloquently. They shut her off of national TV as soon as it came on. But that transformed eventually the Democratic Party, and that's why you got all these elected officials throughout. I'm hoping that maybe we can get our children to register their parents so that they can speak up and vote for them. But we need to come up with some imaginative new theater to celebrate that 50 years and to see how we're going to move the next step forward. I'll try to keep, I don't remember what time I started, but I'll keep going here right quick. None of that was in the speech I was going to give, Bob. Let me just say that I think that we're really at, a very marvelous moment of opportunity in history. And I just hope that we will step up to the plate. We have the know-how. We kind of know how to end poverty, how to help children get what they need. And I just hope that we will do it. Something is very awry in our nation when the tax revenues of 20 states is about the same as our 400 highest taxpayers' income. Something doesn't fit there. Something is awry and out of balance when in 2012, the average pay for CEOs of the top 350 firms was $14.1 million, 273 times the pay of an average worker. The top 40 hedge fund managers and traders made a combined total of $16.7 million in 2012, more than the tax revenue of the entire state of Georgia. Something's not right about that. And something's not right when we're cutting $370 million in a sequester from Head Start, and that is exactly the same amount that we subsidize the jets of corporate executives. That's not right. And if we look at, the amount of corporate welfare, which is about $181 billion, boy, that's more than all we're spending on all these safety net programs, plus a whole lot of things. We need to speak up and say that's not who we want to be as a people. And so let's just talk about the real welfare problem in this country, and let's stop this continuing redistribution of income and wealth from the bottom to the top. And the top 1% now has doubled its income, and so that is at the heart of the structural poverty issues that we're dealing with in many ways. But we have an opportunity to change that. We will have a new report coming out in January on all of this with recommendations, but I want to reinforce something I've heard here this morning is let's just don't be defensive. Let's fight the budget cuts. Let's protect the safety net, but let's have a positive, proactive vision. And let's see if we can all get out of our silos of, what we want to do for our own individual organizations, our own individual programs. And let's come together, folk, if we love our children more, for one big move forward. I've got one proposal for next year. For the next 2 or 3 years, the president has proposed $90 billion in mandatory funding for the Strong Start movement. And we know that early childhood is the foundation for what we get. He wants to put a mandatory program in place, starting with home visiting and early Head Start, and again, the operative word is quality child care, and universal pre-K. And that would be the single most important poverty prevention measure we could put into place. He's got it there. Let's give him a real legacy of putting a foundation for good education underneath our children. But we're all going to have to make a mighty ruckus and a mighty noise to make sure that we get that done. And wouldn't it be nice if, the next time we'll go for the next piece of what we're going to do to end poverty. But let's get ourselves together, and let's put our children ahead of ourselves, our organizations, and make a big noise. And if all the black women's networks and all the church networks and all the Jewish networks, we just decided we're going to set out a 5-year goal and we're going to end this poverty and put one building block in place, we could do it. So I hope that you will think hard about how we're going to start being a real part of the solution and not just a part of the problem. Because we've got all the power we need to do it. If we can make the commitment, the idea that the NRA is setting our policy on gun violence, which is killing and injuring a child every half hour, that's obscene. But we are losing more black children. 17 times more black children have been killed by guns in the last 50 years than we lost in all the lynchings that were recorded in American history between 1882 and present. Where is our anti-lynching movement? What is it going to take to stop the killing of children and to love our children more than the NRA loves their guns or loves their profits? So again, what are we going to do to build this movement? It's going to take a lot of persistence, a lot of persevering, and I love the widow in Luke, which I talk about all the time, and the unjust judge. You all know about that parable, where the old judge didn't care anything about her and didn't care anything about anything, and certainly didn't care anything about justice, but she just kept bugging him, give me justice. And she just worried and pestered him to death until he finally said, let me just give this woman what she wants until she, so she can go away. We need to be as loving and concerned about our children so that your Congress people and your state legislators get so sick of seeing you, they're just going to do what you want. Be a good pest and persevere. That is a part of your strength. I hope you will not be intimidated or be silenced by budget experts or political spin masters, and that you will understand that it doesn't take a PhD or philosophy or doctor of philosophy or theology to know it's morally wrong and hypocritical for leaders to cut food assistance to poor children while increasing subsidies to farmers. And somebody asked me why I was so intolerant about a lot of things and why couldn't I modify my stance and be more compromising. I don't know what the middle ground is between children being killed by AK-47s and being safe in their communities. Don't be so reasonable. Just do what is right and move the needle and remember Mandela and all the rest. And lastly, just understand we're at a very dangerous point in our history. We can lose it all. All that sacrifice 50 years ago and all that sacrifice 40 years ago, people who risked their lives and died to get us the right to vote, well, they're trying to take it away. The poll tax is trying to weird thing. They're trying to reapportion legislatures. They're trying to muck with the Electoral College. If you got 80% of your children who are black and almost 80% who are Latina not reading in 4th and 8th grade at grade level, what are they going to do? They're being sentenced to social economic death. And incarceration is becoming the new American apartheid. Break it up. 1 in 3 black children, boys born in 2000, who's 12 years old today, 13 years old today, 1 in 6 Latino boys. This is the new apartheid. Wake up. Wake up and break up that cradle-to-prison pipeline. Break up those practices in your public schools, zero tolerance. The public schools are the biggest feeder system in many ways into the juvenile justice, into the adult system. Wake up. Fight back. Be there for your children. They're turning the clock back. Ross Barnett's children and grandchildren are in the state legislatures all over. Run for office, and then when you do win, if you win, don't forget why you went there. And really make sure that you hold those people accountable whom you have elected with a mandate to end child poverty, to do something about health care, to really protect the future of this country. So the ball is in our camp, and let's just make sure that we just remember the Fannie Lou Hamers of this era and the Cheneys and all of those who lost their lives so that our children have a better life. Don't let it go back. So I'll just end with Dr. King, quick, go forward. And I heard him the first time when I was 20 in Spelman's Chapel, and I tell this story in almost every speech these days. And he said to us, Spelman girls, in the middle of the sit-in movement, that if you can't fly, drive. If you can't drive, you run. If you can't run, you walk. If you can't walk, you crawl, but you keep moving forward. Do not let our country go backwards and our children go backwards on our watch. Come out of this meeting with some strategies. Thank you.